Hi, I'm Dr. Sasha Thomason, and I'm the director of the Animal Facilities Inspection Program here at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us for this webinar today. For the next 60 minutes, we will be focusing on the recommendations in sanitation, vaccination, housing, welfare, and public health. This is important to KDA license holders because these recommendations outline best practices for pet animal facilities and something to be strived for. Before we begin the session, though, a couple of housekeeping items. During the presentation portion of this session, all participant microphones will be muted by the meeting host. So if you have a question during the presentation, please submit that using the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Our staff will be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and we'll ask all those questions at the end. And this session is being recorded, and for those that can't attend or that want to listen again, and will be posted online mid next week. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lena Datar. Dr. Datar is an assistant clinical professor of shelter medicine at the Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine and the interim director of Maddie's Shelter Medicine program at Cornell. She graduated from the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine and is a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Preventative Medicine and boarded in shelter medicine practice through the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners. Dr. Datar's interests include infectious disease management and prevention, population management and metrics, elective and non-elective shelter surgery, the welfare impacts of shelter design, and shelter medicine instruction. She teaches clinical year students and interns at Tompkins County SPCA, lectures in the veterinary school classroom, provides consultation services, and does research. She served as an author and co-editor for the 2022 ASV Guidelines for Standards of Care in Animal Shelters and is the incoming president of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians. Dr. Datar, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I appreciate that. So as you guys heard, this is our biggest baby that we've put out for a while. We refer to it as the guidelines, but we have multiple different guidelines that we produce as ASV. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have about the Association of Shelter Veterinarians after this, because I think the word has not really gotten out very much, and I think it's an organization with a lot of benefits for people who work in shelters or work with shelters or work adjacent to shelters, work in spay-neuter or work in community medicine where access to care is a big deal. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and I'm going to jump into this. Hopefully it will be useful to you. So today we're going to talk about the history and purpose of these ASV guidelines, to introduce to you a new animal welfare framework for several people, to identify some key highlights from this update in the sections that Sasha said, and then to introduce sort of ways to use this document as a resource to advocate for the animals that are in your care. And also an excuse to show a lot of cute puppies and kittens that are shelter pets. So a little bit of a history on our guidelines. So a lot of you might be familiar with the first version that we published in 2010. It was a self-published document. It wasn't in a journal, and so it was part of the quote unquote gray literature. But a lot of people used it. The framework that it was based on in terms of the ethics of animal welfare in that document was the 5 freedoms. And many of us are familiar with the 5 freedoms, and many of us have those sort of framed hanging on our walls, but I'm going to make the case for you that it's time to sort of move forward with a new framework here. It is and continues to be an evidence-based consensus document. So in the old version, there were a lot of citations, they were within the text, and where there weren't citations, then all the veterinarians who were the authors of that original document, who you can see in tiny little script here on your screen, but who are very important sort of the first thinkers of all of this stuff, they all had to come to consensus and agree on the recommendations that were put out there. And if you know how to herd cats, you might know how hard it is to get 2 veterinarians to agree to anything, and then you put 10 or 19 in the room together and try to get anybody to agree to the same thing. It's actually fairly difficult. So the purpose of the guidelines originally, and as it continues today, is to support organizations regardless of their size, mission, structure, or resources. And so it's meant to really provide the what and the why of sheltering, but not necessarily the how, because the how is going to change from organization to organization. And that not providing that how means that we're not going to say exactly what you should be doing, but that overall the goals of increasing the health and welfare of your animals in your care and meeting those needs that they have is the paramount underlying sort of important thing that this document is trying to help you do. What the guidelines does, like any guidelines that are out there, they are there for you to use as a resource to follow if you would like to improve your own operations, or if you would like to sort of put some sort of a new trial in place and new operation, new protocol in place and see how it works. Does it fulfill its goals, and how would you be able to tell? And this document can help you do that. It can also justify staff or budget decisions to people who hold purse strings, but who don't necessarily understand the work that you're doing. It is also a guide not only to humane care in shelters, but also in humane care in sanctuaries, in foster homes, guide dog research facilities, all sorts of other places and types and manners of housing companion animals, so dogs and cats in particular. It has been translated into several languages, and we are currently working on some translations. We paid for some translations to be done for us, and they turned around, they gave them back to us, and they were not the best quality. So we are currently working on revising those translations for the new document, but there are, the old document was translated into at least 5 different languages, and we hope that the new document will be as well. If you would like to help with that, please let me know after this. And then the other thing that the guidelines have done, and also seems to be continuing to happen with the new version, is that they get incorporated into regulatory language in various states and municipalities. And that isn't the entire point of what we're writing. Like, we're not trying to say this is model legislation, but we are really actually quite pleased when it does get used that way, because we feel that these are they're not best practices, they're standards, they're kind of the minimum practices that we think are required to support the welfare of animals in animal shelters. So the revision, so after 8 to 10 years of using the same document, we realized that it was kind of getting out of date, and there were a lot of things that weren't mentioned in that document that really are part of our normal operating procedures these days, and everyone agreed that it was time to update everything. A lot of new research out there, a lot of new evidence, a lot of new thinking about animal welfare. And so in 2019, the Association of Shelter Veterinarians convened a task force and selected 19 authors to be part of this project. As you can see, that's about twice as many as there were in the old one. We're hoping to maybe minimize everybody's contribution and work effort. I'm not really sure that that worked. But so there were 5 authors from the original project who were on this as well, and then 14 new ones. And we had, in the editors, there were 3 of us. It was myself, Dr. Erin Doyle, who was at the ASPCA at that time and now is at the Animal Welfare League of Boston, and then Jeanette O'Quinn, who is at Ohio State University, who some of you may know. And she's an author on both the old version and this new one. We tried to pick vets who had really quite a breadth of expertise, who had practiced in different parts of the country, different sort of types of shelters that had different roles in the shelter, who really had different areas of expertise, so behaviorists and shelter surgeons and all sorts of people that we tried to really pull in to give us the best of the best advice for this document. We divided all of the authors into different sections, so they are all responsible for at least one section and many for multiple, and tried to put our experts into the section that was the most appropriate for them, of course. And then we embarked on literature reviews, really diving deep into all of the new stuff that's been published since 2010, and even some more old stuff that we managed to unearth, to try to figure out exactly what recommendations were supported by evidence and what weren't. And then we also found some subject matter experts that we were able to pull in, legal stuff, things like that, that we just didn't have the expertise on our committee to really to really do. And then in 2020, in March, we had our first in-person meeting, and I think you can probably guess where that went. It was really lovely to see everybody, and then all of a sudden we weren't allowed to see anybody in person at all. But that didn't stop us. So we did identify the guiding principle of this document as being the same as the previous one, which is that shelters and really any organization that houses companion animals needs to meet those animals' physical and emotional needs, regardless of the mission of that organization, whether they're municipal, whether they are state funded, whether they are grant funded, whether they're no-kill or nonprofit or whatever that looks like. Regardless of their challenges involved in meeting those needs. We don't have a veterinarian on staff. We don't have an LVT on staff. We don't have, regardless of that, if an animal has a need, there has to be a way to meet that need. And then of course, the follow-up question is, how do we know what animals need? And in the previous document, we answered that with the 5 freedoms. In this document, we found something we liked a little better. And this is called the 5 domains. And it is a positive welfare framework that was first described by David Mellor and his colleagues in 2009. And so for the last document, it was still a little bit new. It's based very firmly on the 5 freedoms. So as you can see, these bubbles represent the domains, and you've got domains of nutrition, that's the food and water freedom. You've got environment, that's the freedom from being frightened or being out in the cold. You've got the health freedom, so that's injury and disease. You've got the opportunity, which is also called behavior in some cases. But since you can increase opportunities, you can't necessarily increase behavior, we selected opportunity as the word of choice for our description of this domain. And then all of those 4 domains there, which are sort of the basic ones, feed into this mental state domain, which can be affected either positively or negatively by all of these different domains. And so once you have all of those domains sort of feeding into this mental state, then you can come up with some sort of an overall welfare state for that animal. So I'm doing pretty well, but I'm hungry. I'm doing pretty well, but I have a broken leg and the pain medication is kicking in, and so I'm feeling okay now. Or, I am perfectly healthy, but I'm trapped in a tiny little cage and my mental health is bad because I hate it in here. I'm a cat and I can't stand the barking dog next door. This is just untenable. I'm so stressed out that I'm now gonna have an upper respiratory infection. So that's kind of how that works. The nice thing about this model is that it allows for both good and bad things. So, poor nutrition, obviously not a good thing if you don't give an animal enough food, but if you give them so much food that they are now obese, what is their health and their welfare state actually like? Or consequently, if you give somebody all of the opportunities that they need to make themselves comfortable in their environment, maybe they can now put up with a little bit of pain because it is not as important to them. They have other things that they can do to keep themselves occupied. And so it allows for both the positive and negative aspects of these 5 domains, as well as allowing you to understand that there are times when some of these domains are going to be constrained. Like in a shelter, you have to keep an animal in an enclosure. So the opportunity is going to be constrained, but can we improve their environment, their nutrition, their health to such an extent that their mental state is good and their welfare state is good? And so that is why we like this model quite a lot. How can you tell if you're meeting these needs of this animal? Well, the animals will show you behavioral and physical manifestations of their health. If they're skinny and they're losing weight, maybe we need to pay more attention to that nutrition. Or if we look at an animal and we can see that they're sort of uncomfortable on their feet, maybe we can look at the flooring and say, yeah, this is not adequate housing for this animal. We need to change it, and sort of use our empathy to direct what we alter in their environment to give them that environment that they need. And so it's both perceiving what the animals are doing in that sort of individual animal, but also using what we know about ethology and about facility design and about animals and in their environment to sort of top down tell them what we think they need and provide that to them. So this is everything in the guidelines that we said as a recommendation, especially these key actionable statements that I'll talk about later, comes back to this graph where we asked, are there domains here that we're talking about where we are going to affect the welfare status of the animal in some way or another? And is that going to be on the positive side of this odometer, or is it be on the negative side of that odometer? And do we feel comfortable making those recommendations based on this framework? So to build out this document, then we went back to the original document structure. And if any of you have looked at the checklist for the old document, you know that there are 4 really important keywords in that original document that tell a shelter the sort of level of recommendation that we are giving in each of these guidelines. And those 4 words are unacceptable, must, should, and ideal. And so every time we use those words in this document, it is entirely intentional, to the point where we actually used these particular statements as a scaffold, as an outline for this entire document when we were creating it. So each one of these statements that has one of these words in it has been proposed, voted on, edited, and then approved unanimously by the 19 authors of this document and the task and the ASV board as a whole. There are about 530 of these statements in the document. And this is what they mean. So unacceptable, if you see any sentence that has the word unacceptable in it, it means that this practice needs to be avoided or prevented without exception. Some things that are unacceptable: physical harm to animals to try to change their behavior, right? You cannot hit an animal to make it change its behavior. That is unacceptable. I think we can kind of all agree with that. Some unacceptables in this document are a little bit more controversial, and we'll talk about some of those coming up. Must indicates practices for which adherence is necessary to ensure humane care. So if you don't do what we say you must do in one of these guideline sentences, you probably cannot meet the 5 domains welfare needs of the animals. Should is a practice that is strongly recommended, and in almost every case, compliance is expected, but these also might be things where there is a particular circumstance where it is not appropriate. So animals should have time outside their kennel every day. If you have an animal that's on cage rest because they have a broken pelvis, then okay, maybe not that animal. And ideals are practices that are implemented when resources allow. So one example of an ideal practice is having dental radiology if you're doing dentistry in your shelter. We know that that's not something that every shelter can afford, but if you need some help convincing somebody that this is something that they should spend money on, then we hope that this document and that ideal statement is useful to you. So now, a little bit more on the context of the creation. So I talked about how we first met in 2020, and as you know, things got a little bit more interesting from there. Obviously, we have a lot of environmental impacts from really bad storms and hurricanes, earthquakes, and just environmental events that are a lot of them related to climate change. And this is sort of the world that we're now living in, where these events are happening more and more frequently. And you know, these events in 2005, especially Katrina, were some of the real sort of impetus for creation of these shelter standards in the first place. But it's ongoing. And then we've got, you know, racial equity protests. We had COVID and a lot of sort of political issues with that. And then in terms of, those are all challenges, but then in terms of an opportunity, the ASV has now launched our own academic journal. And so we had the opportunity to now, instead of having this document be published only by the ASV and sort of in the gray literature somewhere, it is now in what we call the white literature. So people can cite this as being from a journal that's peer reviewed, and it has a lot more standing and credibility with people who do research and in academic circles. And so what this led to really was us really having to recognize our role in the communities in keeping pets out of the shelter. That really had to acknowledge and address the role that animal sheltering and animal control practices have played in contributing to systemic inequities in our country. And then also ensuring that the shelters as workplaces are healthy and supportive and inclusive, and that look like the communities that we're trying to serve in order to serve those communities better. So that was all sort of in our faces as we were creating this document. New things in this document include 2 new sections. So we now have a section on forensics, and we now have a section on disaster response, which we thought were both critical sections to have in a document that talks about guidelines for animal sheltering. Not that every shelter is going to do those things, but that if you're looking for help in your community with those things, it's almost always the animal shelter that gets pulled into it. Today, though, I'm going to mainly focus on these 6 sections. So we're going to talk a little bit about management and record keeping of shelters. We're going to talk about facilities, sanitation, a little bit about medical health, including those vaccines, behavior and mental well-being, and then a little bit about public health. And just for full disclosure, in terms of my authorship, I was involved in writing the medical health section and the public health section. So what do the guidelines have to say, these new guidelines about keeping records at your animal shelters or your animal care facilities and management of those facilities? Well, the first is that the shelter's mission or mandate should reflect the needs of the community that you serve. So if you are picking up feral cats and trying to house them in an animal shelter and your community doesn't care that you're doing that, then maybe that's not the best use of your resources. Maybe the best use of your resources instead is to do spay neuter for owned pets who really need it, and that's what your community really needs. Decision making must take into account resource allocation, as well as population and individual animal health and welfare. And this is sort of the bread and butter of population animal health. And it's not something that most people who deal with small animals are used to, because most people who deal with small animals, especially veterinarians, are used to seeing one patient at a time, and that patient has its own advocate, who is the owner. And the owner gets to make all the decisions about what happens to that animal, but it's done in this sort of individual animal context. But as a shelter, if you make the decision to spend a lot of money on one particular animal, you may be now making it so that you cannot provide care for several other animals that you're supposed to be providing care for. And so is that the right thing to do? And there's always a lot of things that go into it, but making sure that you're thinking about the population of animals and everybody else in your care when you're making these individual animal decisions is what this statement is talking about. And that's a must. So we don't feel that you can really adequately provide welfare to your animals if you don't do this. Shelters of any type must have a formal relationship with a veterinarian. That veterinarian could be a private practice vet that says, yes, I will be a veterinarian, and that is it. And so that veterinarian is then who you go to for protocol approval, you go to for advice when you seem to have a patient with a problem, for advice when you have an outbreak in your shelter. It doesn't have to be a shelter veterinarian on staff, although that is also kind of nice, but you just have to have somebody who signs on the dotted line and says, yes, I am your veterinarian. That is all that it takes. We do recommend memoranda of understanding if the organization is not the one who's employing you in terms of that veterinarian, but that relationship with the veterinarian is essential for any organization that is housing animals, because any animal might have a medical problem at any given point in time. And there are a lot of protocols that we recommend for shelters to have. And for a handy dandy list of all of those protocols that can be really useful for shelters, we actually have a bunch of appendices at the end of the document, and you can find that list there. The other sort of little thing I wanted to share with you about our recommendations for shelter veterinarians is that the shelter's veterinarian must have knowledge about their particular population and should have training or experience in shelter medicine. And what we mean by that is that the veterinarian should go to the shelter and check it out and look at the environment, because we all know how important the environment is in animal health. And also, if they are working on helping a shelter, they should seek out CE or read a textbook. There is so much now that is available in terms of learning about how to take care of animals in shelters that we don't think it is too much to ask of veterinarians who are doing that to familiarize themselves with the process. Facilities. So there are a bunch of facilities changes in this document versus the last one. This is one of our most controversial statements, but one that we very much believe in strongly, and that is that individual adult cat housing that is less than 8 square feet of floor space is unacceptable. And the reason that we went with that, and we were so strong in our support of this statement, is that over and over and over and over again, for adult cats that are housed in kennels that are less than this size, we see them come up with upper respiratory infections. It's almost like clockwork. And we know that when you fix that, those cats get better and they stay healthy. And so this is one of those evidence-supported statements that we know that it is difficult for shelters to meet, but we really hope that this document inspires them to be able to advocate for those cats and get that fixed. Maybe it's putting portals in, maybe it's changing the dog kennel to the cat kennel, maybe it's using foster homes instead of the facility that you currently have. There's a lot of different ways to meet this requirement, but it is unacceptable. And we don't think it's possible to provide humane care for adult cats unless they're in enclosures that are bigger than 8 square feet. Ideally, individual cats would have 11 square feet or more of floor space, but again, that's an ideal. And if you can do that, great. And if you can't do that, then maybe it's something to think about for future iterations of what your shelter facility looks like down the road. Multi-compartment housing, which could be 2 kennels that are portaled, or a guillotine door between indoor and outdoor kennels, should be provided for the majority of animals in the shelter. And that is a should, because there are times when you might give an animal a very large, like home-like room where it can be nice to have that second enclosure or an indoor-outdoor door for them to go in and out to potty train, but it's not as required. But it really facilitates cleaning, it really facilitates behavior modification, it really facilitates that animal having the choice of whether to be seen or not be seen by people who are coming around or other dogs that are around. And so we think that this vastly improves animal welfare when it's available. If you are housing an animal long-term in a shelter or in whatever facility it is, the animals must be given additional space and choice within their enclosure. So if you start out at 8 square feet and you know that cat's going to be there for more than 3 weeks, it is a really good idea to try to get that cat into a larger, more enriched space, like a foster home or a sort of a group enclosure. Any one of those things is better than being stuck in a tiny kennel for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. When we say long-term in this document, in general, we're talking about more than two weeks in one enclosure. We also, evidence and consensus of our group really came down on no more than 6 adult cats co-housed in a primary enclosure. And the reason for that is over and over and over again, we see behaviors that indicate stress and competition when cats are housed in groups of greater than 6. And of course, in the outdoors, in feral colonies, more than 6 cats live in a space, but that space is almost infinite compared to a small enclosure in the shelter. It's just really, really hard to prevent competition over resources, access to litter boxes, access to food, all of those things, access to doorways when there are more than 6 there. And it really makes it hard to monitor those animals effectively in terms of their behavior and medical health. Dogs are even worse. So no more than 2 to 4 adult dogs should be co-housed in any primary enclosure. And that is because we see consequences when we get larger groups. Now, there may be individual animals that are adapted to this sort of thing. So cats that come in from hoarding cases. And that's why these are shoulds. But we really do think that if you have one of these enormous group rooms where you've got 35 cats in there, put some partitions up there, and I think that you'll see like a vast improvement in cat welfare if you do that. We have some handy dandy figures in this guidelines now. These are based on drawings by Danae Wagner at UC Davis, who is sort of the facility's queen in shelter medicine. And this is one for cats. There's also one for dogs. And I just sort of wanted to show this to you, what it looks like. So what an ideal, or at least a really good cat primary enclosure setup looks like. And then it's got all these little bubbles with the numbers to sort of show you what details we think are important. So I'm going to leave that to you guys to go look in the document and look at these figures yourselves, because we're really proud of them, and we think that they were really going to help shelters set things up in a way that really helps those animals thrive in their enclosures. Sanitation. So one of the bigger things that we've emphasized in this version of the guidelines is spot cleaning, which is what this picture is showing you. But when you are deep cleaning or when you're sanitizing any sort of place, and sanitation is sort of the combination of cleaning and disinfection, sanitation protocols really must include steps for removing that organic matter, for cleaning, meaning like using a soap or a detergent or something to scrub that space and potentially even rinsing it, and then disinfection, which is a separate step. And disinfection is applying some sort of a chemical that's meant to kill the viruses and bacteria and fungi and whatever it is that is on that surface. Disinfectants that are used in these animal areas must be effective against non-envelope viruses such as parvo, panleukopenia, and calicivirus. And that is because we never know in animal shelters even in sanctuaries, even in boarding facilities, when these pathogens are going to come in. And if they do come in, they can be devastating. These unenveloped viruses are trickier to kill than some. And so the document does go into some detail about the disinfectants that are effective against this. Just know that you have to have the right concentration of these disinfectants, and you have to have the right contact time for that concentration for the particular pathogen that you're looking to kill. Mixing those disinfectants is something we cover in both sanitation and public health because it can be a public health concern. Protective garments, protecting essentially the person, but also protecting the animal, the next animal that's going to be handled, must be changed between handling animals when there's a high risk for disease transmission. And so if you are handling an animal that you think might have calicivirus or you think might have panleukopenia, it is essential, you must change your garments before handling the next animal in order to prevent exposing them to that. Shelter workers are far dirtier in terms of what we have on us than any adopters are. And so we don't have this requirement for adopters in adopted housing, and we reserve these requirements for animals where there's a high risk of disease transmission, but it is unacceptable to give another animal a pathogen when it can be prevented, if you can prevent doing that. And then spot cleaning. So we talk a lot about spot cleaning because it is really quite protective in terms of their animal welfare. So spot cleaning means that an animal is staying in their enclosure and they're going to be there tomorrow. And instead of taking everything out and disinfecting everything, you leave the things in there that are clean and you remove the things in there that are soiled, much like you might do tidying your bathroom in the morning or tidying the cat box in your home. And if that animal is staying in there and there's sort of, they haven't, not puppies, they haven't painted everything with poop, then you are probably fine to just scoop the box, change their food, give them some fresh water. If there is a towel that's soiled, if there was some, vomiting or something, then remove that towel and give them a new one. But that gives them a familiar space with familiar scents and allows them to be a lot more comfortable. And it saves a lot of time for your shelter workers, especially if you have multi-compartment housing. You can do this with virtually not even touching that animal, which really decreases the fomite spread in your shelter. In terms of medical care, so some interesting statements that we wanted to highlight, that again, individual animal health must be addressed within the balance of decisions and practices that support overall population health. And so if you have a really sad kitten like this one that has panleukopenia, and you have a catheter and you have IV fluids and you can put them somewhere and they can get treated with it for it, but by doing that, you're putting all of your other kittens at risk, then maybe that's not the best decision. And so maybe this is a kitten that needs to be euthanized so that you can protect the health of the rest of your population. And those are decisions that are best made preemptively. So coming to a consensus with your organization about how you're going to handle these things that are sort of inevitable when they come in your door. Or having criteria where you say, yes, we're going to treat it, but they already have to have been in foster, and then we're not going to use that foster home for a particular amount of time, or we're going to ensure that the foster home is disinfected in some way. So that population health aspect is really critical, because if now 14 animals die because you decided to treat this kitten, that is not acceptable. Preventive medicine schedules in shelter medicine practice differ from general practice and individual animal practice. And so these vaccines schedule that you'll see below, and we'll talk about a little bit, are different on purpose. And we know they're different, and it's not that we're not following their guidelines, it's that we have different reasons for recommending what we do. And then vaccines and other activities also can help with outbreak management. Obviously, we need to recognize pain when it's being shown by our shelter animals, and then having provisions for emergency care. Not that you need to be providing that emergency care on site, but that you need to have a plan for what happens when you need that, are all essential activities and described very sort of specifically in this medical care section. But just to sort of highlight these vaccine schedule for you, you can see that for shelter animals that are housed in the animal shelter facility, we recommend starting vaccination at 4 weeks of age. Now that is 2 weeks earlier than any of the private practice guidelines. And there are some shelters that vaccinate even earlier, and that is fine too. So both for dogs and cats, 4 weeks of age for parvo and the panleuk vaccines. And that is to prevent those animals from dying from those diseases and also to protect the rest of the population. You can give a Bordetella intranasal vaccine at 3 weeks. And so we recommend doing that, especially in shelters with a lot of kennel cough. And then rabies, almost every state allows you to give rabies at 12 weeks. If you're doing a TNR situation and an animal comes in and they're not quite 12 weeks, we still think you should give it. And so there's a little bit more of an explanation for this in the document. And then ASV is also in the very beginning stages of making some vaccine guidelines that will have a lot more justification and explanation for these. The other things that we recommend for vaccination are vaccinating animals at intake, even if they're pregnant with these modified live vaccines, and even if they have other diseases, because it is much better to have a vaccine reaction or something than it is to die of pamuk. And then animals who come into the animal shelter must be vaccinated with core vaccines at or before intake. And so this means essentially within a couple of hours of coming into the animal shelter, it is a critical life-saving practice, especially in the face of an outbreak, but even not in shelters that are having outbreaks, you never know when one of these animals that's carrying these diseases is going to come in and expose everybody. And it's so easy, and vaccines are so safe. I had to give a little Halloween humor in here, so sorry if this freaks anybody out. So behavior and mental well-being, this is a expanded section in this guidelines, and it is this and the medical section are the longest. And we had a lot of people with a lot of really, I would say, stellar behavior credentials who worked on this with us. Any animal experiencing mental suffering, distress, or behavioral deterioration must be urgently assessed and treated in the animal shelter. And that could be medically treated for their pain that's causing them their mental suffering. It could be medications, behavior medications. It could be euthanasia. It could be moving them to a foster home. There's a lot of different ways to address this mental suffering, distress, or behavioral deterioration, but it must be addressed and treated. And there are no exceptions to that one. That really has to happen. Requiring that animals go through a formal behavior evaluation test is no longer recommended. I'm gonna say that again. So requiring that every animal that comes into your shelter, especially dogs, to go through a formal behavior evaluation test is no longer recommended. And that is because we have found that doing studies on these tests, they fail to predict behavior in other homes. The animal's behavior in the shelter is very different than it is in the home. And so we have animals that pass these behavior tests that go on to bite somebody. We have animals that really do poorly on these behavior tests that do fine in their home. And we cannot use them. They are very bad at predicting what the animal's going to do in their home. There are other things that are better. And there are other ways of getting the same information. And so having your staff who are doing intake exams document the animal's behavior during their intake is very similar to those same sort of sub-tests that happen in this behavior evaluation. And you have to do them anyway to give them their medical care, or at least it's very strongly recommended that you do them to give them their medical care. And so if you're doing a veterinary exam and you're looking at their teeth, that is almost, it is the same thing as doing the behavior sub-test where you lift their lip and see how they react. And so it becomes a team effort instead of an individual behaviorist's effort. And everybody being aware of animal behavior ends up really supporting the animal a lot better than just having one person whose job it is. So there's a little bit more of that in the document. I encourage you to read it if you are concerned about this. There are some times when a behavior evaluation test is actually recommended. It's just not routine and not everybody, and it should not be increasing your length of stay by holding animals back because they haven't had one, especially when they've been beautifully behaved with everybody they've encountered in the shelter, and whoever brought them into the shelter. Positive social interaction, mental stimulation, physical activity must be provided daily that is separate from feeding and cleaning. And so animals need interaction with people. They might need interaction with their other animals of their kind. They need to get out of their kennels. They need to have some floor time. They need to do what they do on a daily basis. Behavior medications are very much supported by this document, and we really think that they must be strongly considered to address welfare concerns related to emotional health. And so we really recommend that veterinarians who are working with shelters familiarize themselves with the safety of behavioral medications and help shelters create protocols for using these medications without needing to talk to the veterinarian every single time. And then finally, shelters must have protocols and criteria in place that attempt to identify and manage animals that are at high risk of causing harm to shelter personnel, to the public or other domesticated animals. And this could be redirected aggression, it could be offensive aggression, it could be resource guarding aggression, and whatever that is, if there's a high risk of causing harm to shelter personnel or the public or other domesticated animals, the shelter must have a protocol in place and a way to manage and identify those animals, whether that's euthanasia, whether it's some sort of particular way of adopting them out, whether it's waivers, whether it's training classes. There's a lot of different ways, but that management needs to happen. It is irresponsible to adopt out animals that are high risk of biting somebody and not having owners in the public be aware or be informed. So we're almost there. So we've got public health, and then I'm going to just talk about how to use this document, and then we'll open it up for questions. So public health. And what we mean by public health is just sort of the interface between human health and then the animal work that we're doing. And obviously there's a lot of that, like there's all the zoonotic diseases, and then there's workplace safety, and there's all of the different hazards that we have in animal shelters, which are myriad. Sometimes I'm surprised that I make it out of the day without another scratch or another bump. But shelters really, we must, as safe workplaces and as responsible workplaces, comply with local, state, and federal safety regulations. And there are a lot of those that concern the chemical, biological, and physical hazards that are in our workplace. Everything from anesthetic gases, from sharps, from slip and fall type of situations, from disinfectant mixing, all of those types of things, zoonotic diseases, rabies, quarantines, all of those things. One of the things that we put in here as well is that PPE must be provided by the shelter, by the sheltering organization. And so if your shelter says you have to bring your own PPE from home, that's illegal. And you can show them this document that says that they must provide it for the workers and volunteers and adopters and whoever needs it to keep them safe from whatever is happening. And those potentially harmful substances could be animal feces, they could be chemicals, they could be medications, whatever those happen to be. Routinely using antimicrobials like antibiotics to prevent infection in healthy animals is unacceptable. They're absolutely required to treat infections, but it's unacceptable to use them to prevent infections. And so if you have a shelter that wants to put every animal on doxy at admission so that they don't get kennel cough, that is unacceptable because it creates resistant bacteria, and those antibiotics are no longer going to be useful to us in a couple years if everybody does that. It also might impact human health. And so if those antibiotics are no longer usable in people, then they might have to reach for more expensive and harder to stomach antibiotics when we have infections. And finally, shelters should strive to become workplaces that emphasize staff wellness through a positive organizational culture, fair pay hours and expectations, provisions for self-care, and access to mental health support systems without repercussions. And these are all direct quotes from the guidelines. We all know that animal sheltering, that veterinary medicine and animal sheltering are both professions where suicide and suicidal ideation are a lot more common than the general public. And so you get those two forces combining, both the shelter side of it and then the veterinary side of it, and you end up with people who are at risk. And so whatever shelters can do to try to make their workplace a supportive place and prevent that, it is really on us to do that. Like that is one of our responsibilities, is to make our workplaces supportive for people and to let them get the help that they need when they need it without making them feel bad about it. So say you've read now the document that's 85 pages if you include all the appendices and glossary and all the resources that we give you. But how do you even start now? And so that is a big question that we get from a lot of different organizations, especially those who are sort of shelter adjacent, like research facilities, where like some of these things are not really applicable to us, but we want to meet the other things. Where do we start? And so really, what we would like you to do is look at those 30, 35 unacceptable statements that we have in there and address those. That's the first thing to do, because we think those are the highest priority and will make the biggest impact on your animal welfare. And then what we recommend is sorting the musts and the shoulds by importance and ease of implementation. And so if something that takes almost no time at all and almost no thought at all to implement, and it's a must or a should, you should do that right away. If it's something that's a must or should, it's going to take a really long time and that costs a lot of money to implement, then maybe that's something that you put off for a while, but maybe you start asking for that money now. You like start that capital campaign, you start that grant project, you start looking for somebody in the community who can help you. And then ideal practices, address those as your resources allow. So if you've met all those musts and shoulds and you're ready to keep going, then keep going. We really want to encourage that. We want to both elevate the practice of those who are really struggling, and also allow those who are really sort of flying to continue their flight and continue their success. So we hope that this document does that. We know that every organization is uniquely situated and has challenges that impact their ability to implement these practices. And so we recognize that there are some things that are going to be harder for some shelters to do, and some things that are going to be really easy for some shelters to do, and that's going to change from shelter to shelter. And so in closing, I just wanted to remind everyone that this document, we really hope, is something that improves both human and animal welfare, because once you know that you are providing the very best care that you can to your animals, if you have the skills, the resources, and the authority to do your job really well, then it improves human, animal, and population health. And we hope that this is a tool that you use to do that. So in terms of this and other resources, we have these checklists. We have checklists that are associated with this that just have the key actionable statements if you just want those. We have a sortable Excel file with just those statements if you want to sort them by unacceptable, or sort them by must or should, or sort them by a sort of a way of your own devising. We have our spay-neuter guidelines. The last time they were published was 2016. They're due for revision. We have a bunch of position statements on our website. We have discussion boards if you want to come and hang out there and ask questions of experts. And then there are a whole bunch of different shelter medicine textbooks that are out there that are available these days. And so even if you can't access the internet, even if you can't go to a webinar, take these home. It's a little light bedtime reading, and we hope that you are as excited about sort of applying these principles as we are. This is a QR code for the document, so if we want to leave this up here, I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Char. That was great information with it. I actually want to start kind of where you ended up at, about other resources and setting priorities with that. And we talked about textbooks and statements, etc. But are there any existing educational courses out there, or online courses that may be available to take a deeper dive into what you've presented?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I would say there's a couple different things. So there is a not super cheap a master's program in shelter medicine at the University of Florida online. You can do a mini version of that called a shelter medicine certificate. And you don't have to be a veterinarian to do it. You can be, a nonprofit manager, you can be animal control, whoever it is. But so a set of 3 courses for their certificate, or you can do a whole master's degree in this sort of thing. And a lot of those courses are based on the guidelines. We had a lot of phone calls from those folks who run that program when we were putting these out, because they were really excited to have them. And then we're really scrambling to sort of implement all of our new recommendations into their courses right before the semester started. So that's one. Another one is what we lovingly refer to as the ASV Reboot Camp, because we love our puns. And so all of those videos are actually, so this was an event that we did in, I believe it was May, but all of those videos are available on the ASV website as resources. And so we go through each one of these different sections with sort of key highlights by one of the authors of that section. And so you can watch those videos online. And then the other one is, if you're more onto the behavior side of things, there's like fear-free certification for shelters, which is free for anybody who works in animal shelters, and is a great resource for anybody who's interested in learning more about animal behavior.
Great. I want to kind of go back to your priorities and your topic areas. And you said you've added a few this year, which you started off your presentation with. How did you decide what new topics to add and why?
Yeah, great question. So the forensics and the disaster response. Part of what we did when we were really starting out the rewriting of this document was to survey our stakeholders. And so we sent out surveys to everybody that we could think of. It was shelter managers, it was shelter workers, it was veterinarians, it was everybody that does this sort of work, that has a stake in this game. And we said, what's missing from our document? And they said, well, we do this disaster response thing all the time. There are so many hurricanes now. We need like some guidance that's not like best practices, but we need like standard practices for what we should be doing here. And then a lot of folks were like, there's nothing in here about forensics. And obviously we can't do there's there's whole textbooks on disaster response, and there's lots of textbooks on forensics. And some of those textbooks are from the pathology side, where you like need to be a board pathologist to do some of those things. And we're not expecting any of that. It's just really a basic, like, if you want it, like every shelter needs to have a policy about forensics, whether it's we don't do forensics, that could be a policy, or it's we have an entire like locker system with special locks that people have special keys to for storing our evidence when we're doing these types of cases. And so we just really want people to have a plan, to organize themselves, to understand what best practices, what practices might be out there in terms of that. And so just some really basic things about forensics. The forensics section is super short, but it's really just sort of a basic, here's what you need to be thinking about when you admit an animal that might be part of a case. And then the disaster response is, some of it is focused on the animal shelter that is in a disaster, because any animal shelter could be in a disaster. Like anywhere you are in the world, you're going to have some challenge environmentally that's going to get you, whether it's man-made, like the toxic train fumes that were wafting over Ohio earlier this year, or whether it's like a little tiny disaster like we have up here in upstate New York, where, you know, ice storms come and the power goes out because the power line tipped over and now the shelter doesn't have any power. And what do? Like, you have to have a plan. And so what that section really says is you need to have a plan for the disasters that are common in your area. Recognize what those are, create a plan for those. If you can work with your city, that's even better. If you are a shelter that is sort of a disaster responder in your local community, make those MOUs with those organizations around you so you know what your role is in that disaster response. Are you going to take animals in from the community? Are you going to hold them for people? What does that look like? And then if you're a shelter that responds to faraway disasters, what does that look like? Do you have a response team that goes out and like does technical rescue of waterlogged animals, or do you receive animals from shelters? And both, there's things to think about for both of those. The first one is that if you're receiving animals from animals in disasters, they shouldn't be displacing or causing your care for the animals that are already in your care to have a lower quality.
Great, thanks.
Also,
I have one last question for you that's come in. So if any of our participants have one they'd like to ask, please put that in the chat. But the final question that's been submitted are, what are some of the main challenges that you've seen recently in the shelters in your area?
Yeah, so and this is sort of a loaded question for me because I'm also on the board of Shelter Animals Count. And so I hear a lot of challenges that are all kind of all over the place and looking at numbers and things. But certainly here in upstate New York, we have been experiencing the same thing that a lot of shelters have, which is extended lengths of stay of our dogs. And especially big dogs, especially dogs with some minor behavioral challenges like the jumpy mouthy or like the sort of human fear type dogs. And it has been really, really hard to get those animals to move out of the shelter. And I don't really know why. I have some theories. I think that one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that we saturated homes that like were maybe gonna adopt an animal in a year or two, and they just all adopted all at once. And now they're full of a dog already, and so they don't want another one, and so that becomes very challenging. It's possible that some of the spay-neuter pauses that went on during the pandemic led to more litters of animals that were poorly socialized. It's possible that people not being able to get out and socialize their animals led to animals with more behavior concerns, and so those are the ones that we're kind of left over with. But shelters have always been challenged by animals like that, and I feel like we've been able to get them out better. It's possible that inflation had a role to play in that. I know that some folks are really worried about the repayment of student loans coming due, really sort of impacting human ability to pay for their animals and take care of their animals as well. And so I don't know how well that's going to do. It's so complicated. But yeah, so I think that's been one of our biggest challenges.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Thomason. I'll turn it over to you for some final words. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Datar, sharing your expertise with us this afternoon. Everybody have a good afternoon. I'll see you later.